Hello, this is Samantha and Zessie.
It's your boy, Remoy George Phillip, the first.
And this is masculinity. Now, if you guys know us by now, you know what we're getting ready to talk about.
Warriors.
That's right. That's
God,
right.
It was such a boring finals, and I love Warriors basketball, and I love it all, but I gotta admit I was bored.
It's not right. It's not right. I mean, I'm happy the Warriors won, obviously, but I just feel like for the spirit of competition, like there's got to be an actual fucking competition.
But this is all working in LeBron's favor. This is part of his genius. I wrote a think piece about this, but how LeBron
I haven't
has
read it yet.
put himself as the ultimate underdog. So no matter what, even if he loses, like our expectations are low, we're like, yeah, nobody's going to beat the Warriors. He can't beat the Warriors. But if he wins one game, if he gets like incredible stats one game, you're like, oh my God, LeBron, amidst the trials and tribulations of playing the juggernaut that is the Golden State Warriors, he was able to do this.
Yeah.
He still wins. So shout out to LeBron.
I mean, my brother has this theory about LeBron saying that, he just wants everything to be about him and like how much better of a basketball player he were if he, well, this is longer than maybe we'll bring Stanley on the podcast and he can explain to y'all what his theory is, because it's actually very good and I'm 100% behind it, but now that it's time for me to explain it, I can't. So we're going to go ahead and let it go.
Yo, did you hear about that thing that's going on today where dudes like everywhere are wearing heels to work and wearing heels all day and like a show of support for women and like walk a day in a woman's feet?
Oh
That's
my God,
badass.
that's amazing.
I don't have
Where
high
the fuck are your heels.
I didn't know about it until Twitter told me, like, as I was on the train. I was like, I got to go to the store and buy some heels. I got to go do Payless sell high heels? Maybe I'll go to Payless.
They do. That's amazing. Get wedges. They're more comfortable.
I'm going to learn a lot of lessons today while I wear heels. We'll get some
so
photo evidence for you that later.
Yes, please do. We'll be posting that on the social for sure. So in previous conversations, we've talked about the idea of intersectionality. So as a refresher, intersectionality is the idea that certain experiences of discrimination based on race, class, gender, etc., for one person may be different, maybe a different experience for someone else who is of a different race, class, and gender. And those two experiences of discrimination should not be considered exactly the same. So today, we're excited to marry two topics that we've talked about earlier in this season and use an intersectional lens to better understand how they intersect with masculinity. Of course, the performance of masculinity spelt with a K. So it sounds like a super deep conversation, but luckily we've got some help today coming from rapper and activist and the amazingly funny actor, D-Lo. So D-Lo, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Dope. So before we go any further, we just want to practice what we preach and give people an opportunity to find themselves. So to create a safe space, D-Lo, if you don't mind letting us know what your pronouns are and how you identify.
Right. I identify as queer and trans, and I use the pronouns he, him, and I don't mind they.
Got it. Awesome.
Cool. So now, yeah, I don't think any straight person has ever had to explain what being straight means or meant. So I do, and we do apologize for this question beforehand. But D-Lo, if you could explain in your own words or however you feel possible, what does queer trans mean to you or mean?
Right. Well, queerness I use in a way that gay was used back in the day to sort of be an umbrella term for people of different sexual orientations or genders. But queer to me also is related to the fact that as queer people, we've had a politic that has been placed on our bodies. And queer people to me are the ones who challenge the world to understand sexuality and gender to be like a regular ass thing, I guess. Queer has a social justice sort of connotation, and trans to me is just anybody who doesn't fit in the binary. And I know that we have terms like non-binary and gender non-conforming, but trans to me shows up in a multitude of ways. And yes, we do have folks who are trans who fit more of what the look of the binary is, but we definitely have trans people who exist and present in ways that are very non-binary.
Got it. So let me just see if I got that right. So essentially, you know, your understanding and your kind of like definition of trans, I mean, I guess definition, that's, you know, quote unquote, right? But is essentially just non-binary.
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. So I'm actually part of an immigrant family. I was born in Paris. My family is from Cameroon. I grew up in the Bay Area and of California. So Remoy's mom is from India. She grew up in Africa. And then Remoy was born in Texas. In the previous episode, we were able to better understand that not each immigrant story is exactly the same, but we share some very similar themes. So I just wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about your and your family's immigrant story.
Yeah, so my parents are both from Jaffna originally. My mother was in Colombo. She was older, but they had an arranged marriage in Jaffna. And then my father, he was a medical resident who had the opportunity to go to Queens to work, or actually in New York, but he was living in Queens. And a couple of years later, he called for my mother and sister to join him. And then at some point, one of his friends, who was also a doctor, was asked to take a job in Lancaster, California, which is an hour away from Los Angeles, but a world apart. And because they were looking for other doctors, this particular Sri Lankan guy, Tamil guy, called for his friends to come and join him, saying that there were jobs there. So, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 Sri Lankan Tamil doctors ended up working there and, bringing their families with them. So that is the community that I was raised in. A couple years after they all got there, maybe 3-4 years after that, in '83, there were the what's known as Black July, or where the government went after Tamil people, and it was a genocide. So around this time, the beginning of the Civil War, not necessarily the beginning, but kind of the moment in which everything was coming to a point. A lot of Tamil Sri Lankan people sought political asylum in other countries, and so a lot of our community ended up sponsoring their family members to come to the States. And so our community just kept getting bigger because of that. And then that was the community that I was raised in. Is even though we were in a hick town, Lancaster historically, a little bit of background is that it was where the first West Coast KKK church, in quotes, was established. So it was a very hate town, racist town.
That's
country.
Quite a contrast right there. That's a big contrast.
Yeah, totally. So that's how we grew up is in that. But again, we were a very insular community. Even though we were going to school with white children, we weren't really allowed to mingle with them. Our community was very Tamil Sri Lankan, very hyper Hindu, because now the Civil War played a huge role in the backdrop of how we were understanding our identity as immigrants and as Tamil people, Tamil Sri Lankan people in the States. So sometimes, with things like war, you end up becoming hyper Hindu because of your religious background, why your folks back home are getting persecuted. So anyway, that's kind of the story of my immigrant upbringing. We were all flies in the buttermilk out there.
I mean, I can just imagine having that as a backdrop while you're, growing up with your own, just like the things that we grew up and like in as teenagers and all of that, or having Lancaster as a backdrop, being a Sri Lankan immigrant. And I'm just wondering, is there, like, there are a couple of things that I want to get into, but first, is there a typical masculinity, the performance of masculinity associated with Tamil Sri Lankan culture? Like, did you see a typical or atypical masculinity in your household growing up?
I think that, like everyone, our understanding of masculinity is through our fathers or father figures. And so ours was a very typical, traditional sort of household where, my father worked, my mother stayed at home. My mother wasn't fully educated, and she was basically the housewife of a professional. And I'm saying this as far as like how the world would see her. She's a lot more than that in my eyes. And so my father, I think that masculinity to me was, appearing to be strong and not emotional, and strength being based off of how much emotion you show. My mother would, because growing up, I saw my mother as weak. And, I understood later, like, her so-called weakness was actually just her being a fully rounded emotional person. And I understood that the tables were actually turned if we were really supposed to be looking at, like, who was emotionally stronger in the relationship was always my mother. But, it's a typical immigrant macho sort of masculinity. It is one that, there's no room for softness. There were some people in our community that were soft, like more like meaning cis men who were softer, but you could tell like they weren't really fully respected as much. Maybe they were, everybody allows everybody to just be, but like the more masculine you are, the more respect you got. And that's typical across so many cultures. But it wasn't like anybody was kind of offended by a softness in masculinity. It was just that that's not what you wanted to have if you wanted to be a cool guy, the levels of, toxicity around the performance of masculinity is all throughout so many different cultures, societies, etc. But I feel like when I've seen how masculinity plays out in South Asian cultures, which is the closest thing that I have to compare to is Indians or Pakistan or Bangladesh, or when I hear stories of what masculinity could look like, I don't remember anybody exhibiting that kind of behavior to that kind of extreme. And I don't know if that's an island culture thing or the fact that the immigrant community that I was a part of was, stuck in a hick town and only really had each other. So there was an element of softness that you had to have in regards to the larger white patriarchal society that they were living in. White supremacist, society, patriarchal. But,
wow.
So, I think that when, I remember my father coming home just angry and stressed all the time. And it's, my mother said he was stressed because of work, but the truth of the matter is that when you're functioning in a workplace that is questioning you or providing an environment where you don't get to thrive necessarily, like you just feel like you have to put your head down and just do your work, and that's because of racism, then, that plays out. Like you end up becoming a grumpy motherfucker. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And my father always talked to us, especially me and my sister, about racism. Like, he never told us, but his way was not to have agency around it. His way was like, you're in another country. People are gonna treat you different. They're gonna look at you different. They're gonna give you a hard time. But just keep your head down and continue doing what you're doing, and don't say anything because you'll get beaten up or you'll get backlash. Like, he was very free about telling us these things, but his narrative was like, you can succeed and survive this if you just keep your head down and work diligently and get to where you need to go, and then you can just leave. You can do what you need to do and get happy, but you have to work hard.
So we had, a recent episode with Remus Sharma, who is, part of Saki, and it's like this organization that focuses on providing support to women who are survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault within the South Asian community, right? And one of the things that we were talking about specifically in line with this is like having the backdrop of like racism and white supremacy outside of the home, like lent. And I mean, I can also share this, from the West African community or the Black community, like kind of lent to having like a lack of power for men that they then took out when they came into the home. And like they took out within the home. Yeah. And it's interesting because what you described earlier is like this notion that instead what it kind of lent itself to, if I understood correctly, within your community or within your house is like instead of softness actually that got built within the community of more of like a support, because there was so much like the extreme of white supremacy outside the home was so real that instead it brought people together and made them made them supportive to one another rather than the opposite, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, I think that it's all situational, like how things get played out. But I do feel like I'm not trying to write the narrative of my community without saying that I know that there are nuances here. I'm not trying to generalize what happened with the men in my community, but I do remember the general feel as a child of what was happening. And there's things that I know could have probably helped our community thrive better and survive mentally, but it was based off of how the men were interacting and that was going to happen because it's not typical for men to be quote unquote burdened with the task to bring people together. That was more of the women in our community who understood on such a deep level that community building was central to staying connected and thriving as a community. And so a lot of the organizing socially and culturally happened by the women, which benefited the men and the children. But again, this is also how people view masculine people, is that they don't necessarily have to be the organizers in the community because the women are there to pick up the slack.
We've been talking about like women carrying emotional burdens for men, for people, for families for a while, and I feel like that speaks directly to that. And I just want like kind of like circling back now. You're growing up in this huge context, in this very complex context, and I just like for yourself as you're kind of garnering these notions of masculinity, these notions of who you are, how you're growing up, kind of coming into your own in your identity, like what does it look like then for you to come out to your family? When did you come out? How was that experience?
Yeah. So, growing up, I was always like the I guess more masculine of the two daughters that my parents had. And so when I was, and the thing is, nobody gave me flack for it either. Like, I think that sometimes when people see people who are assigned male at birth exhibiting quote unquote feminine behavior, they will lash out more towards that than they will for someone who is assigned female at birth exhibiting quote unquote masculine behavior. And so I was left alone. I looked like a little boy. I acted like a little boy. All my friends were boys, and I had toys that were meant for boys, and nobody gave me any heat for that. But at some point, as I was growing up, I think it was like around 5th and 6th grade, I realized that people were starting to sniff that I was different and that understanding was not cool. And nobody I knew, I remember when I was even younger to that and realizing that there weren't girls who had crushes on other girls. And I was like, but I'm a boy and I have a crush on a girl. Like, it's just because I have a vagina that people are calling me a girl, you know?
Yeah.
And this was at a young age. This was like in my single digits. So by the time I was like 11-ish, I started my transition the other way. I always talk about it as my first gender transition was me becoming a woman, becoming a girl. And it was through that lens that I understood even more so than as a masculine girl child when I was younger, the disparity in how you were treated, like just all of it, and what you had to sort of succumb to because of the pressures of the social construction of gender. So, I guess it's like my disguise of being perceived as a woman in my early teens. I started really understanding how, because at the same time that I was going through puberty, so were the younger boys that I used to play with, and I could see something happening with them. Their softness, their kindness, their love, sort of start getting hardened, and hardened because they were surviving the rest of the world around what it meant to be a brown boy in this very white, hick town where all the in kids were white, and that was fine. You could be left alone, but then you might be seen as gay or weak or whatever if you didn't show behavior that was similar to that very the toxicity that was beginning in young boys at that age. So you know, seeing that was happening, and then now I was a recipient of this toxicity. I was like, oh wow, like this is not the jam. Like I remember having a really, really good friend, like a best friend in high school, and he basically turned on me. And I was like, what the hell happened? And I told this story to so many people, and I hear it from other women and men who are like, yeah, I was best friends with this guy, and then one day it was like as quick as you know, it raining one day. It just happened. Like I lost him and I couldn't reach him, and that was the end of it. And our relationship was never the same after that. And that's what happened to me with this really good friend of mine. And I know that wasn't his fault. Like, I can understand that in retrospect. I can understand that the world is stronger than any one of us, and that we might not have the language or the wherewithal to understand that there's another way to show masculinity. But at the time, it was devastating. And so that lived with me for so long, and I think that that's also what influenced how I was. Like, I don't believe that I am being masculine, and yet that is what I am being. And whether that's me, and there's a blend, because how I exhibit my masculinity is with the same love that wasn't shivved out of me. You know what I'm saying? It has a different flavor, because in my feminine presentation, I was encouraged to be more tender and loving and all of this stuff. And that's, you know, that's what my masculinity involves right now, is that it might look to some people like a blend of feminine qualities and masculine qualities. But in my mind, I'm like, this is our problem, is that we've associated hardness, anger, rage, you know, like all of that stuff with masculinity.
Yep.
And we've associated like softness, love, all of this stuff with femininity, and that's the problem. It's like, why can't women be assertive and hard and fierce, and it not be called masculine, but it still be called feminine? And why can't masculine people be cis men be loving and tender and kind, and it still be seen as masculine?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, thinking about those lines of intersectionality that we talked about earlier, would you say, and maybe this is what you just said, and so we're just going to repeat it, but is there such a thing as, you know, masculine queerness, or is that kind of what you're talking about right now?
Like, so I've hosted workshops that are literally called queer masculinity. And it is for folks who are navigating masculinity as people who are assigned female at birth. So whether that means that they identify as a butch woman, or more masculine ID'd, or trans masculine, or just even as a trans male, that's kind of what the workshop centers, is our relationship to masculinity. And so, because even for so many people still, even within queer circles, we have bought into this belief that masculinity means disconnectedness. And as I grew up in community, it would be that masculine of center folks would play this game that was so heteronormative, it's just normative, where if you saw another masculine of center person at the club or out and about, like, immediately it became this cock war. And it's silly, because it's like, we're gay as fuck, and then suddenly we're acting as if we've got to, like, put our foot down and say, this is my domain and I can't be friends with you, and you know, that's not how we roll. You get what I'm saying? I don't know.
Yeah, that becomes
as
that.
If those same rules apply.
It's those negative effects of the performance of masculinity that suddenly manifest that are so surprising, but then also kind of it makes sense because we've been taught a lot of these masculine performance traits for so long, no matter who you are.
Exactly. So that had always baffled me, and you know, here I was trying to just be like the way that I didn't participate in that was by being a clown and using comedy to sort of, you know, neutralize this stupidity. And because even I might get caught up in that shit by accident. You get what I'm saying? If my critical lens wasn't on all the time, and if my desire to just make people laugh wasn't so fucking high, on a bad day, I'd participate in that bullshit. You feel me? Yeah. By accident. So I think that, you know, this is when we talk about queer masculinity, it is to be able to say that this thing, as it exists, is really just nothing, like it is not real. And so to be able to play with that and to be able to challenge that is what's so very queer.
Mm. Wow. Well, I mean, there are so many ways to go along with this, but all I want to say to respond to that is that what you pointed to is an exact like example of like, I think a lot of times people think that, you know, when you're queer or when you're a woman or when you're any combination of, you know, of the recipient of patriarchal bullshit, that you're somehow not part of the patriarchy yourself. And I think
Right.
that what you just pointed to is like a perfect example of like, yeah, no, we have to check ourselves. Like we absolutely have to check ourselves as a recipient of the bullshit as well, because this is something that we all contribute to. So, I just appreciate you bringing that up, because I think a lot of times people just assume that like, you know, somehow we're absconded for that. It's like, that's not actually true. So just to kind of, you know, you've got a long resume, you know, you're a poet, you're a rapper, you're an actor, you're a stand-up comic, you're an activist, you're a panel speaker. And with all the work that you're constantly channeling and working through parts of your identity, it seems. And so, you know, that it seems like that would include your family's immigrant story, your gender, your sexual orientation, et al. And so out of those, we're just wondering, like, is there one that affects or takes a higher precedent in your work?
My identities?
Yeah.
Or the craft. I also wouldn't say that I'm a rapper, but like I started off doing hip hop and spoken word, but not so much as an MC, more kind of a little bit as an MC, but I would just call it poetry. Anyway, to your question, as far as which identities, like I feel like, you know, I identify as an artist first and foremost, and and this is not to take away from my my labels as or how I ID as somebody of Tamil Sri Lankan descent, as a queer and trans person, et cetera, et cetera. But the place that I feel is the foundation for my contribution in this world is as an artist. And that lens is Tamil, Sri Lankan, American, queer, trans. But that's not to say that, like, in no way, shape, or form am I trying to pull the IDs apart. Like, it all lives in one place. But the easiest way that I can explain it is that all my identities get to be powerfully used as in my role as an artist in this world.
It makes so much sense. Like, how would you parse out one over the other, and how does one take, you know, more space within the work when it's all a part of you and it's all part of your identity, right? And speaking of work, what do you got coming out? Is there something that the listeners can see you in or hear you in? What's going on?
Yeah, well, so one thing that I'm really excited about is that I run a queer open mic here in Los Angeles. And I would have thought that, it was, that this space was just for me, like for me to enjoy being a part of LA's thriving queer arts community. But what I realized is that 20 years ago, when I was creating spaces for folks, there was such a need for it. And people used to come up to me and be like, thank you for creating this space. And it's happening still today in LA, is that through this space, people are still coming up to me and saying, thank you for this space. And I'm like, wow, like I know the world has changed, but the part that has changed for the worst is that our technology keeps us isolated and not in community space. And so we have to really be diligent in seeking those spaces. So when somebody puts up a queer space that is just like really easy and you don't have to perform. Like, you can get up on stage and perform a piece, but you don't have to perform being a human. Then people are so grateful. So I have that. That happens the first Thursday of every month in Los Angeles. And then I have, professionally, I have a whole bunch of stuff happening. So that's, whether that's me writing for content, online content, or digital series, and the shows I'm always performing. Everything's kind of on hold for a little, well, not on hold, like I'm still doing everything, but I have, so, like, one of the things that I'm super excited about is the possibility of going to Sri Lanka at the end of July and working with queer and trans people over there. And then I have a tour, an East Coast tour that's happening in October, and really two special projects that I can't really talk about until they actually happen. It's Hollywood; anything can happen. One day they say you have it, and one day they say you don't have it. So yeah, just a bunch of really good things happening, and a lot of collaborative projects, and just doing the damn thing. But I think this summer, what I'm really looking forward to is the travel.
Well, we thank you. We thank you for sharing your work. We thank you for being being a voice that is appreciated and supportive of inclusion. And specifically, we just thank you for being willing to make that contribution and to create spaces for other folks to, because, I mean, with the way that things currently are, right, how we're regressing, I think that it's like, of the, it's just, there are no words to really truly express the necessity and the gratitude the necessity of your contribution and the gratitude that we feel for it. So thank you.
I thank you for that, and I thank you all for doing the good work as well.
So what we're gonna do is we're going to be posting all of your information on our social media so the good people can find you. So for you listeners out there, you already know it's going to be Masculinity Podcast on Facebook, and then Masculinity Pod on Twitter, always spelled with a K. We're going to be posting all of Dilo's information and, of course, all the things that he has coming up, everything that's in the pipeline that we can get our hands on.
We may leak a script that Samantha and Dilo are working on together. I don't know. It could be happening. What's up? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. Cool. So you guys know where to find us. Please shoot us an email if you have anything that you have to say about this conversation that we haven't covered. masculinitypodcast@whoistheo.com, always with a K. Thank you guys so much for listening. Dilo, thank you so much for being here.
Pew, pew, pew.
Thank you for having me.
So my name is Samantha and Remoy.
My name is Remoy George Philip the First.
And this has been Masculinity. Thank you for listening.
Peace.
Ciao.